Well, hi, folks. Welcome. So my name is Christopher Rondina, and obviously I'm going to be the presenter of this evening. And I like to think of myself as you could call me a ghost chaser, you could call me a ghost researcher, a ghost tracker, but not really a ghost hunter precisely. You know, if you see these shows on TV where everybody's running around in dark rooms with lights and, going, oh my gosh, what was that? I've done it. I've definitely done it, and it's a lot of fun, but it's not really what I do. Most of my ghost chasing takes place in a lot of places like this, archives, libraries, and things like that. I'm a lot more about tracking down the history of legends and myths. I like to think of myself more of a legend hunter. That doesn't mean I don't believe that maybe there's something out there. There's certainly, I've had some experiences in life that let me believe that there's a lot more out there than maybe we all realize, but certainly I wouldn't say that I'm out there trying to trap any ghosts. I will say that tonight's talk, well, maybe have a little hint of the paranormal, but it's a lot more about history and folklore than it is about anything like that. And questions are absolutely welcome. You are going to be my guinea pigs for this presentation. This is the first time I'm doing this particular one, so you get to see the firsthand, which probably means that I'll sound like a babbling idiot. Nothing wrong with that. So without further ado, I'm going to kill the lights and we'll get started. Thank you very much. I think just the far one, and then the, there we go, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. Thank you. All right. Sleepy Hollow, the lost history of the Headless Horseman. I'm going to try and find a good space to stand here. I'm going to have to click that button every once in a while. So when I was probably about 9 years old, I've always loved Halloween. I've always loved spooky stories. When I was about 9 years old, I had been trick-or-treating on one particularly blustery Halloween night. It was really one of those perfect nights where the weather was perfect and everything was right. And at the end of it, my brother and I and one of our friends had retreated back home and dropped all our costumes off, and we're doing what I think probably all kids probably do, is bartering for candy. You all trade off what you want and everything else. I particularly hated bit of honey, so I was going to get rid of all of those. And of course, we were watching TV. But it was the 1970s, and the 1970s, so I had 3 channels to choose from because we didn't even get UHF back then. Rabbit ears with tinfoil and all that kind of good stuff. So really, there weren't too many things to choose from. But one thing that was on that we watched was the Disney Halloween special. And Disney Halloween special, if you ever got to watch one of those, is mostly a bunch of very goofy cartoons with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and witches and ghosts and all that kind of stuff. Nothing terribly spooky. But this year it was different. Because, of course, it still had all that stuff, but at the end of the presentation, or the end of the show, all of a sudden, the music got a little bit more sinister, and it got very spooky, and suddenly there was this whole, scene of a frightened man riding a horse, racing through the woods, being chased by something dark and very spooky, and, at the end of it, this, flaming-headed, headless horseman kind of kept leaping out of the darkness. And I thought it was the neatest thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was scary and it was amazing, and I was absolutely fascinated. And I fell in love that night with the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Let's see here. Get my buttons going. So I like to think we all know the story, but I don't know how many of you people, let's get a show of hands. How many people actually read the original legend of Sleepy Hollow? Generally speaking, you don't get a lot of hands going up, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a 200-year-old story, and not many of us read that kind of thing. But I will say this much. Not too many people know the legend of Sleepy Hollow the way Washington Irving wrote it. Is it a ghost story? It absolutely is. But it's also a whole lot of other things, and we're going to discuss that a little bit later. But the primary aspects of the story people tend to be pretty familiar with. You have Ichabod Crane. The hero of the story? Maybe, in a sense. He's a bumbling country schoolmaster, a little bit socially, with a little bit of social ambition, and certainly the new face in town. Katrina Van Tassel, the beautiful heiress that Ichabod Crane falls in love with. Maybe he falls in love with her, maybe he falls in love with her father's fortune. Kind of hard to tell sometimes. And last but not least, the last member of the romantic triangle, Brom Bones. Abraham Van Brunt, his actual name, but Brom Bones was what everybody calls him in town. He's described as a burly, roistering blade, comes racing through town on a horse all the time, doing madcap tricks. He's sort of a bully, but also sort of the town hero. So these are the three primary characters of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, unless I'm missing anybody. Oh yeah, there is one more. The Headless Horseman. Now, the Headless Horseman is probably the most iconic ghost in American history. In fact, in a lot of ways, the Headless Horseman is our first great ghost story. People many times refer to the legend of Sleepy Hollow as the first great American ghost story, and Washington Irving, its author, as the first great American writer, truly American writer. And I think that when people think of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, certainly long before they think of Ichabod Crane or Katrina Van Tassel, they tend to think of the Headless Horseman. And in many ways, even if Washington Irving may not have intended it that way, he is the star of the story. Now, this is 2019, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was written 200 years ago. 200 years of this great ghost story and all its iconography. So Washington Irving, born in 1783, died in 1859, has a very wide body of work, but there is nothing he is known better for than The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow isn't a novel. It's actually a comparatively short story. It's the heart of a book called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, and it's a huge compendium of all sorts of stories, many of which are travelogues or humorous stories. He was quite a humorist. In fact, even The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in many ways, is a little bit of a light comedy. Now, Washington Irving wrote the story when he was living abroad in England, and he was very homesick. He had spent a lot of his youth living in the Hudson River Valley, where Sleepy Hollow is located, and he had grown truly, truly homesick for his way of life back there, and he loved it so much. And so he wrote the story, and the fascinating thing about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was that in many ways it was never intended to be a ghost story. If you read it, and I would certainly highly recommend anyone to read it. It's not nearly as dry as you would expect from a 200-year-old story. In fact, it's in a lot of ways a very fresh and very modern feeling story, but it's a charming travelogue. He talks about the landscape. He talks about the food. He spends more time talking about food in this story than he ever does talk about ghosts. It's certainly a homesick love letter to his life in post-revolutionary America. And the ghost story weaves its way throughout The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, kind of popping in and out, because the one thing that everybody knows about Ichabod Crane in Sleepy Hollow is that he is an immensely superstitious man. He believes in witchcraft, he believes in ghosts, he believes in everything, and there is nothing Ichabod Crane likes more in life than sitting by a country fireside and listening to the old Dutch wives spin ghost stories. And the ghost story they probably spin more than any other is the legend of the Headless Horseman. Now, as far as the ghost story goes, he sums it up pretty concisely. The dominant spirit that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be the commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air is the apparition of a figure on a horseback without a head, said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle of the American Revolution. The body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head. And the specter is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Now, Ichabod Crane finds this story not merely fascinating, but honestly terrifying, because he spends an awful lot of evenings sitting with these Dutch wives, sitting with these old matrons in their houses while they cook or sew or do their chores, and he listens to their stories, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's the one thing he likes more than anything else, until the evening ends, and he's now got to walk home through the woods. And every single night, he ends up walking home through the woods, and every shadowy tree, every snow-covered bush, every single thing he sees is a ghost, a goblin, or an imp out to get him. And so he gets home, he's absolutely terrified, pulls the covers over his head until the next night, and he goes and listens to more ghost stories. The man is certainly a glutton for punishment. Now, the legend of Sleepy Hollow has certainly seeped into our collective consciousness. As I say, it's the great American ghost story, and it's certainly well known through things such as my first introduction, the 1949 cartoon, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, it's a surprisingly charming cartoon. If you haven't seen it in a while, I highly recommend it. It's actually great for adults, too, because while it's very much a children's cartoon, it also has the wonderful vocals of Bing Crosby singing songs. He sings his way through the story with some amazingly catchy tunes, and tells a very faithful version of the ghost story. But that climactic moment when I saw it on screen with the Headless Horseman rising up in the saddle with his flaming head, like I said, that was the one that I think for most American children, me included, certainly burned itself into my memory. Now, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow has been made into a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows over the years, although I have to say, some of them not terribly effective, some more effective, but one of the most notable ones, interestingly enough, being that this is the 200th anniversary of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Coincidentally, it's also the 20th anniversary of Tim Burton's 1999 film, Sleepy Hollow. Now, if you're not a fan of horror movies, you may not have had a chance to see this one. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close this up. I will give you all fair warning if you decide to see this. The two things you'll know about the movie Sleepy Hollow is that it can be fairly gruesome, although it's a fairly lighthearted film. It doesn't shy away from some gruesome scenes. It actually was an homage in many ways to classic films made in the 1960s and 1970s by a British studio called Hammer Studios. Hammer Studios made some great classic Dracula and Frankenstein movies, but they were very well known for a time that it was some of the first horror movies filmed in color and to actually show blood on screen. And so people were both horrified and titillated at the same time, and so the movies had a real big influence on a young Tim Burton when he directed this film, and so he really brought that style back to it. So not only is it a fairly gruesome film, be warned if you're not into that sort of thing, but it also is a radical departure from Washington Irving's story. He did as many people do. He took The Legend of Sleepy Hollow's primary story, the ghost story, and he spun it into a much bigger, much crazier story about witches and ghosts and conspiracies. So it really bears very little resemblance to Washington Irving's story. However, it's still probably the most well-known cinematic interpretation of the legend, and it had quite a star-studded cast, including, notably, Johnny Depp as a much more attractive than normal Ichabod Crane, because the normal Ichabod Crane is described as being a man who effectively looks like a walking scarecrow. He has a long sniped nose, oversized ears. He's got a long spindly neck. His head is supposed to look kind of like a weather vane turning on a spit. He has feet like shovels and arms that dangle a mile out of his sleeves. He's supposed to be an incredibly awkward-looking man. For some reason, it seems like every time they portray Ichabod Crane since then, they've managed to make him very dashing, because everyone wants Ichabod Crane to be the hero of the show. And in a lot of ways, I suppose, he's at least the anti-hero. Also, Christina Ricci starred Michael Gambon and many other very notable British actors. Now, one of the most unique portrayals actually premiered just a few years back. Of course, every year that goes by, it seems like it's longer, but in 2013, Fox Television premiered a television series called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In many ways, they took the example of the Sleepy Hollow TV show and turned it into a sort of a modern, almost a crime drama. In this fairly gonzo version of the story, Ichabod Crane, his wife, Katrina Van Tassel, is a witch, puts him under a spell, and he wakes up 200 years later in modern Sleepy Hollow, just in time to defeat the Headless Horseman who's risen yet again. It's a kind of a crazy show. It's sort of like the X-Files meets Sleepy Hollow, but it was tremendously fun, and once again, after many years off the air, it brought Sleepy Hollow back into the public conscience. Primarily filled with actors you wouldn't have heard of, but of course they kept the dashing idea of Ichabod Crane. Everybody's beautiful, everybody is fun, and they're all running around battling monsters every week. And if you do have an opportunity to see it, I think you'd find that it was an awfully fun thing to watch on a Halloween evening. Now, with all this being said, cinematic interpretations of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman are a dime a dozen. But Washington Irving, when he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, wasn't trying to create quite that sort of thing. He wasn't looking for a giant monster hunting adventure. He was creating a very, very classic folkloric ghost story. And he didn't create the Headless Horseman from thin air. He created the Headless Horseman based on legends that he had heard from all over, including from the Dutch settlers there. Now, the Dutch settlers kept a lot of their old folklore, and so did many other people in the area. Washington Irving himself was Scottish and had an old Scottish grandmother who told him a lot of old Celtic tales. So some of the stories that had influenced him included Hans Jägenteufel. Believe it or not, that means Hans the Hunting Devil. And he was a headless figure who used to roam around the woods of the Black Forests of Germany. And he was out there, whoops, that wasn't supposed to happen. So far, that's the first technical glitch, so I'm not doing so badly. So Hans Jägenteufel was a man who in life had been incredibly evil. And so something that was very common motif in folklore is that evil men who were not caught in life, it was believed, I suppose, that because an evil man, if he had been caught for his crimes, would probably be beheaded or hanged, that an evil man who never pays for his crimes in life after death suffers the curse of becoming a headless ghost and basically suffers the beheading or hanging that he would have suffered in life. And then is cursed to wander, often bringing other evildoers to justice. And that's exactly what Hans Jägenteufel would do. This is a story that the Grimm brothers discovered. And the particular story talks about a young woman who goes into the king's forest and starts collecting acorns, which even such a simple thing to do, it's still the king's forest and she had no right to do it even though her family was hungry. So she's considered in some kind of a broad way to be an evildoer. And so the headless ghost meets her, takes pity on her, and ultimately ends up letting her go. But it's a classic fairy tale, one of the many collected by the Grimm brothers, and certainly one that may have influenced a young Washington Irving. Celtic folklore gave us many headless ghosts. One of the most notable was the Death Coach, or the Coach of Bower. And this is very, very similar to the Headless Horseman legend in that these spirits, the headless ghost, the headless rider, often even the horses were said to be headless, would ride through the night and would collect souls who had died that evening. So the Coach of Bower was both the death coach that collected souls, but also in many ways was considered to be an omen of death. Now, one way that this actually shows up in comparatively common popular culture. Has anybody ever seen a wonderful movie? You might watch it around St. Patrick's Day called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. If you haven't, it was an old Disney film, a fantastic film full of wonderful Irish folklore. But in the end, the main character is on the brink of death, sort of the big climactic moment, and the headless horseman and his coach actually show up to collect his soul, something that obviously, again, a large part of Celtic folklore. But there is one ghost, one spirit above all that may have influenced the legend of the Headless Horseman, and that is the Irish Dullahan. The Dullahan effectively means dark man or dark rider, and this is the Headless Horseman personified in so many ways. Once again, this is not actually supposed to be a ghost precisely. It's meant to be a spirit, or what the Irish would often call the dark she, the dark fairy. It was a spirit whose entire purpose was to collect the souls of the dead. And this is one of the most gruesome figures from Irish mythology. He carried his head along with him anytime he rode, sometimes in the pommel of his saddle, sometimes under his arm, and he lit his way with his head. The eyes and the mouth would glow and send out this, miasmic green light into the air. He carried the grisly spine of a human being as a whip, and he would use it to whip evildoers along. He's an incredibly gruesome character, but in almost every way mirrors the concept of Washington Irving's own Headless Horseman, and probably the most likely influence on his story. Now that is the folkloric beginning that may have given birth to the Headless Horseman legends that were common in the valley at the time that Washington Irving was a young man. But it doesn't end there. So the legend of the Headless Horseman had become common and throughout the Sleepy Hollow Valley, which is actually the Hudson Highlands, about the time that Washington Irving was only about 15 years old. This is the time in his life when he first started exploring the area called Sleepy Hollow and the town of Tarrytown, and he heard all these old legends. In fact, coincidentally enough, there was nothing more that Washington Irving loved in life than sitting at the old firesides with the old Dutch matrons and listening to them tell these stories. The character of Ichabod Crane, while not a terribly flattering character, in many ways expresses exactly who Washington Irving was. And he was hearing this legend not merely as a legend from the old country, but he was hearing this legend as a current legend, a legend connected to the legend, to the time of the Revolutionary War. As he says in his earlier segment, and says in the book, his ghost isn't supposed to be some old Irish spirit, but rather the ghost of a Hessian trooper who was supposedly killed during the Revolutionary War. So how did they bring it forward to history? What could connect them to the modern time? Now, it turns out that there is some truth to the legend of the Headless Horseman. In 1776, on November the 1st, at the end of October in 1776, one of the larger battles of the New York campaign took place, and it was called the Battle of White Plains. Most people have heard of the Battle of White Plains because it was a very well-known battle. That ended on October 28th. In the days following the Battle of White Plains, the two armies, the British Army and the American Army, were slowly sort of breaking down and beginning to drift apart. Basically, the major aspects of the battle were done, but like often happens in war, small skirmishes continued to happen, everybody trying to take advantage of people when they were in disarray. And a group of Hessian soldiers being German soldiers hired by the British Army as mercenaries, saw an opportunity to strike at a small American encampment near Travis Hill. They approached the hillside, and things didn't go quite as planned. And why do we know this? Because of Major General William Heath. Major Heath was one of George Washington's top commanders in the New York campaign. And Major Heath, let me kind of try to set the stage here. Generals don't really worry about what's happening to individual soldiers. They don't have the luxury to do that. They deal with regiments, they deal with battles, they deal with battle plans. He's not really concerned with a lot of what's happening to individual soldiers. But one particular soldier, one particular day, did catch his attention, and that suggests that it was a very spectacular event. He wrote a journal which he published in 1798. And that 1798 memoir described the battles that he participated in, leading right up until the battles of White Plains. And there's one particular passage that grabbed someone's attention a few years ago. The British artillery, in this case, mixed British and Hessian soldiers. The British artillery made a circuitous movement and came down toward the American right. Here, unknown to them, were some 12-pounders. This is a small cannon, a very mobile cannon. Unknown to them were some 12-pounders, upon discharge of which they made off with their field pieces as fast as their horses could draw them. A shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman, and they also left one of the artillery horses dead on the field. Now, it is extremely unusual for a specific death in an enemy soldier to end up making it into this general's notes. You'll never find this anywhere else in the journal, but it was such an unusual event and apparently so grisly and spectacular that he could not help but mention it. And the fact that he brought this particular Hessian's story to light started to gain a little traction, and people started to talk about this story because the Hessian was left behind on the field because, as you can see, his fellow soldiers fled. And what other losses they sustained was not known, but the British made no other attempt on the Americans while they remained at White Plains, which means to say that the Hessian and the British soldiers there never came back for the headless Hessian left dead on the field. That's important. Now, German soldiers at that time, Hessian soldiers were a very, very specific area. They weren't just Germans. They were actually from Hesse, which is in the heart of Germany. And this was an area, Germany back then was broken up into all sorts of principalities, all sorts of little small areas. And the princes of the different areas would often rent out their armies. They would literally rent out their armies to make extra cash. It seems a little bit tawdry, but Hessians are often referred to as being mercenaries, mercenaries being soldiers for hire. But one thing you have to understand about these mercenaries is they weren't pocketing a lot of money. The prince that owned their services, that actually had them in his thrall, was the one pocketing the money. When these Hessian soldiers were sent to American shores to fight for the British against Americans, they never made a nickel more than they would have made anywhere else. And very few of them were doing this willingly. They were sent here against their will. They were conscripted into the army, put on boats and sent 4,000 miles from home to fight in a war they knew nothing about. So they were certainly not quite the money-hungry monsters that they're often portrayed as. Knowing all of this, I thought, when I decided that I wanted to write a book about the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and specifically about the history of it, I learned about this particular Hessian soldier, this headless young man who'd been killed on the battlefield, and I thought, well, obviously, I can't write a sensible book about the history of the legend of Sleepy Hollow and not mention this soldier. And obviously, I also thought that finding his name seemed like the smartest thing to do. So I approached every possible source. I looked at records, I listened to historians, I found every scholar of Irving I could, and nobody knew who this soldier was. Now, it was clear that he had really existed because when Major Heath wrote his journal, this is one of General George Washington's primary soldiers. Clearly, he wasn't going to make this up, and there was nothing to be gained from it. He wasn't trying to capitalize on the legend of Sleepy Hollow. It wasn't going to be written for another 200 years, another 20 years. So clearly, this man had really existed, and if he existed, I knew that records had to exist. So, finally, after hitting every possible dead end, the only place I could find that had records of the Hessian occupation of America during the time of the American Revolution was the city of Marburg in Germany, where one of the largest Hessian archives in the world, and certainly in Germany, exists. So, I packed my bag, immediately decided that I must have failed because I couldn't interpret anything I was seeing. At this point, I thought there was no way I'd be able to get any information out of this. I thought that it would be an easier find. I don't know why I thought that. Clearly, I was insane. So here I had all this paperwork, and it basically was useless, or so I thought. But I couldn't come back empty-handed. I'd just flown halfway across the world. So I photographed every single document in the best detail I possibly could, and over the next several nights laid in my hotel staring at my tablet until my eyes were crossed, trying to make some sense of them, praying that I could find what I needed. Now, here's what I had. I knew that this soldier had died on the 1st of November of 1776, so I had a specific date. I knew that there were 3 regiments present at that battle: Lossberg, Kniphausen, and Rahl. These were the 3 generals who ran these armies. These were the 3 that ran. So I had a limited number of soldiers to choose from, and I knew the day that he died. And I thought, how many soldiers could have been killed that day? It was a fairly small battle. It didn't seem to be a lot of other soldiers had died. So I thought there was a chance, but boy, I got to tell you, this was a daunting proposition. So staring and staring and staring. The one thing I hadn't reckoned with is that this picture you're seeing right here is what's called a muster roll. It's the deployment records for German soldiers. But the backs of each sheet were much more offhand. It was lighter, it seemed very casual. Some of them had very little information, some of them had a little bit more, and I almost didn't record them because they seemed like they were just notes. But I ended up recording them anyway, and thank goodness I did, because while staring at them, I suddenly saw one word that made sense to me. Withplane. There was no way that it was a coincidence. Nothing that sounded that much like White Plains could be a coincidence. And so I started to look a little bit more carefully. Oh, I apologize. I'm going to jump into something other quickly. The particular record that I'm looking at here is the record of one regiment, and that is the Regiment von Rahl. It was a Hessian Grenadier Battalion. Grenadiers were grenade-throwing soldiers. You can see a picture of what Hessian soldiers would have looked like right there. And actually take a quick note of them and even the uniforms they're wearing, because that might be relevant in a minute. Now, the Regiment von Rahl, under the command of Johann Gottlieb Rahl, a very, very accomplished lieutenant who happens to look an awful lot like George Washington, but I don't hold that against him. But here we had Withplane. Now, I thought this has clearly got to be a reference to White Plains. And now I started to see something else. Now, one of the other regiments that was there was commanded by Colonel Kniphausen, and I'd seen his name here, and that didn't surprise me until I suddenly realized that I wasn't looking at his name specifically. What I was looking at was Fort Kniphausen, and I hadn't really paid attention to that, and realized that it wasn't referring to the general, to the colonel, it was referring to Fort Kniphausen, which was a location. And suddenly I realized that this column was all locations. So what was the rest of this information? And I needed to try to start piecing it together. So one by one. Now this, by the way, was specifically for November, so I knew I had the right month. So I looked a little more closely, and that first character there didn't mean anything to me until I remembered something that I vaguely knew. Oh, here we go again. Vaguely knew, which is that Europeans don't write one as a single slash. They write it as what looks like an A without a crossbar on it. And when I realized that, I suddenly realized that that was a date, that that was the German version of writing first. So it was November 1st at White Plains. And suddenly I knew I was absolutely on the right track. And in fact, I thought I had my man until fate threw a little bit of a curveball, because there were 2 soldiers that died at White Plains that day. And can I tell you honestly, maybe you'll follow me up when you think that, if I got all the way to Germany and could only narrow it down to 2 soldiers, that would have been worse. I was basically like, you know what? Shoot me, I'm done. At that point, I would have lost the whole thing. But I figured there had to be a way to determine if one of these 2 soldiers was the right man. I knew he had to be, but how did I tell the difference? So I stared and I stared and I tried to figure out who these men were and how I might be able to tell the difference. And I noticed something kind of unusual. Well, the first actually, by the way, that word up there, I wasn't having any more success reading it than I think you folks are right now. But luckily, I met a student in Marburg who gave me a little bit of assistance, and he told me that this word was totgeschossen, and it meant shot dead. Now I knew that this was a casualty list, and suddenly I was a lot closer than I had been before. Now, the second soldier on that list had a weird little word in front of his name, and that word is Tam, T-A-M-B. First, I thought it was an F, because again, having some difficulty writing this, but I realized it was Tam, and I didn't realize it until I saw that the word actually meant, it was an abbreviation for timbre, and it meant he was a drummer. Now, if you know anything about the military, you know that back then they used drummers to keep marching time and to communicate between regiments. So this man, who had clearly died at White Plains, was a drummer. Okay, fair enough. What about the other guy? Oh, and there's your drummer. What about the other guy? Well, I couldn't tell what his rank was. I couldn't recognize the word up there, but I did see one word that was kind of interesting. So this gentleman seemed to be part of a regiment called the Lieb Company. Lieb Company. So I did a little research, and Lieb Company, an elite fighting corps often assigned to protect high-ranking officers. So I thought, okay, well, so now how does that translate? We have 2 soldiers, a drummer, and we have a grenadier from the Lieb Company. Which one could it possibly be? Stop doing that, Christopher. So this is what the general had said. He said, a shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman. So I want you to look at the 2 uniforms. How easy do you think it would be to tell these 2 apart? If you saw these 2 and you knew, because you were an experienced general, if you knew what a drummer's uniform looked like with the chevrons and everything else, the uniforms are not terribly similar. In fact, they're quite dissimilar. No accomplished general, George Washington, one of his second in command, is going to mistake an artilleryman, a combat soldier, for a 16 or 17-year-old kid carrying a drum. So there's no possible way. It didn't make any sense to me. And that, unless the general had made a grave mistake, that was my answer. If it was an artilleryman, it had to be the grenadier. And if it was the grenadier, then the headless soldier killed that day was Heinrich Range of Milzungen. Died on the 1st of November at White Plains, exactly as had been reported. Now, there's something you may not have picked up on through all of this, part of the Grenadier von Rau, something you may not have picked up on all of this, and that was that he wasn't merely beheaded, but he was beheaded on November 1st, 1776, All Hallows Day. The reason that All Hallows Day exists, or Halloween exists, is because it's the eve of All Hallows Day, a day that's actually believed in folklore that the gates between here and the spirit world are wide open. So I don't know if that was a coincidence or not, but there would be nothing in the world that was a better birthday for a ghost. So here we had the closest we could ever come to a historic headless horseman. In fact, he was a headless horseman. So the headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow? No, not at all. In fact, he died near White Plains, New York, a good 7 miles away. So why on earth would he be considered the headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow? Well, there's a clue that Washington Irving gives us. By the way, as we discussed earlier, Sleepy Hollow very much exists. North Tarrytown in the Hudson Valley, known today as Sleepy Hollow. Beautiful little town, very simple, very kind of classic little Americana town. Gorgeous, gorgeous old church dating back to the 1600s with a beautiful cemetery. But it's a beautiful cemetery that has one particular feature. The body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth each night to the scene of battle. So here's something I had to ask myself. How did a Hessian soldier from White Plains end up buried in an American cemetery in Sleepy Hollow, about 7 miles away? This is kind of a bone of contention because it doesn't make sense, in fact, that the people would have done that at all. He was a soldier of a foreign army. They wouldn't have put him in their own cemetery, or would they? The church was one of the only churches in the region, and 7 miles, that's not very far. On a horse, you can ride 7 miles in about 45 minutes, or probably less than that. So it's not a long trip, even if it may sound like that in those days. With a cart or a horse, bodies of the dead easily carried that short distance of time, especially for one of the only churchyards in the area. But why would they have buried him there? Well, here's my question for you. Can you identify a headless soldier? Look at these 4 uniforms, and obviously they're quite similar. So which ones are Hessians and which ones are Americans without a head? Any suggestions? Well, true. Okay, we may have given away the ghost with that one, literally speaking. However, so here we go. Hessian, American. Hessian, American. That's great. But they didn't have a head. So what anyone collecting these bodies, and by the way, it wouldn't have likely been the army, it would have been once the army had moved on to their next position, the people, local people would have come out to collect the dead and deal with them. And so they would have seen these uniforms, and please pardon me for being a little gruesome here, but certainly not clean and tidy by any means after the way that this war had gone. And if they found a young man laying in that field, head long gone, and didn't know, because they didn't have a lot of military experience, how easy would it be to assume that he was one of the fallen American soldiers? And so, quite possibly, carried to the churchyard and interred along with American soldiers. So, Private Heinrich Range, which is the actual pronunciation of his name, according to my German friends, does not have a gravestone in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery because as far as anyone is concerned, there's no official records of his burial. Will that ever exist one day? I like to think it should, because something interesting happened when I first started telling this story. This is a ghost story. This is a story about the Headless Horseman, but it's more than that. The first time I ever told this story, I realized that after a while I was talking about a story not of a monster or a ghost, but of a 24-year-old kid from Melsungen, Germany, probably a farmer who'd been conscripted into the army, sailed halfway across the world, and died 4,000 miles from home, never seeing his family again. And he'd been forgotten. History had literally forgotten that he existed. And I thought, now that's really the crime in all of this, is the idea that, was he truly the Headless Horseman? I can't say that for sure. What I can tell you is that the chances of him having inspired the creation of the Headless Horseman are pretty hard to dispute. There is no other headless Hessian from the annals of Sleepy Hollow's history and the Hudson Valley's history so perfectly mirrors the story, and one that certainly Washington Irving had plenty of access to hear that story, both from locals and from the published journal of Major William Heath. It's not proof. Folklore doesn't usually work that way. Folklore to history is just not that easy of a process. But I believe in my heart that clearly he was the right man, and that the most important thing is that he was a man. He was a man who was forgotten and probably buried without even the dignity of his family knowing his fate. And so I'd like to think that by bringing Heinrich's story out into the public, that he's no longer forgotten. And if that little bit of justice happens, then I'm okay with it. But there is one thing that if you know anything about ghost stories, you know, is that ghosts are often considered to be born of violent deaths, trauma, great explosive moments of passion and violence. And so if anyone was ever going to come back, and certainly out there in search of his head to find himself, make himself whole again, I would have to say it would probably be the Grenadier Heinrich Range, who, by the way, is really kind of interesting thing. Does anybody know what a grenadier is? The key word is right there, grenade. They were grenade throwers. They kept these leather satchels on their pouch that are filled with clay grenades, maybe about this big, heavy, which is why the grenadiers were usually chosen from the bigger, bulkier farm boys that had a little bit of muscle to them. Their entire purpose in existence was to take a lit, flaming grenade and fling it into their enemies, exactly as the Headless Horseman does in the climactic scene of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So, whether or not it's a coincidence, Heinrich Range was born to be the Headless Horseman. And there you are. So I'm going to hit the lights, folks. Whew, that's bright after that. So very happy to take questions, hear what people thought about the presentation, and again, forgive me for any bumps in there. Like I say, this is my first time doing this, and actually my first time even with the PowerPoint presentation, so feeling my way around a little bit. But does anyone have any questions or any thoughts on the topic?
Yeah.
Yes.
In the beginning, like your first sentence almost, you mentioned the Dutch.
Yes.
Now, the Dutch legends, are some of them like this?
Well, with Holland's proximity to Germany, they certainly carry over an awful lot of their folklore from German folklore and legend. And Germany has a lot of different legends, not just Hans Jägenteufel, one of those ones we were talking about, but Germany also has legends that are often connected with headless hunting figures such as the Wild Hunt, which is a very classic German piece of folklore. And although it's true that the Dutch and Germans are not precisely the same people, they carry a great deal of similarity and overlap in their legends and folklore coming from old Germanic tradition, much of which actually comes down from people like the Norse, with characters like Odin, who rode through the sky on a hunting horse and had hounds baying at his heels. So the idea of a horseman who comes for the souls of the dead actually definitely has a very big presence in Germanic mythology, which would pass down into both the Dutch and the Germans. So for the Dutch people who settled the Hudson River Valley, much of that was settled by the Dutch to hold on to those old beliefs. Plus, the Dutch people were probably more than most very, very dedicated to their supernatural beliefs. I'm sure you've all seen things like Dutch hex signs and things like that. The Dutch held on to a lot of their old beliefs in magic and superstition and charms and things like that, even into the early 20th century in ways that many other communities had sort of let pass by. Well, if no one else has any questions, I will let you know. No hard sell here. I do have copies of my book, which goes into much greater detail on the topic of the legend of the Headless Horseman, and anyone who is interested in a copy is very, very welcome. I have paperbacks, which are $20, and a very small number of limited edition hardcovers, which are $35. And if anybody would like a signed copy, I am, of course, delighted to do that.
Did you go down to Sleepy Hollow yourself?
Oh, yes, many times.
Okay. Did you ever find any ruins? R-U-N-E-S.
Runes, like actually like Nordic runes. I have never actually seen runes. I've heard that there are rune stones in some of the woods out there, but that's not terribly uncommon, of course. A lot of areas, especially here in the Northeast, because they say that so much of the Viking incursion actually made it down into this part of the world. I mean, I come from Newport, where we have Vikings on practically everything because we believe that the Vikings made it that far south. So it's not unusual to think that, especially such an incredibly accomplished sailing culture, that they made it down to places like the Hudson River Valley. But no, personally, I've never seen runes carved into any stones or anything down there. So, all right. Well, folks, thank you so much for coming in and joining me this evening, and I hope you enjoyed this. And like I say, if anybody's interested, you let me know. And other than that, you have a wonderful, not just a wonderful evening, but a really happy Halloween.